Good morning. Buenos días. Welcome to the third day of this conference from war to politics on the peace accords in El Salvador. Bienvenidos a todos. I'm Barbara Weinstein. My name is Barbara Weinstein. I think most of you are return participants, but for the a few of you who are new, I'm going to just introduce myself, say a few more words about how the conference will proceed, and then say a few things about the organization of the conference and the first couple of days of the conference. So I'm Barbara Weinstein. I'm the chair of the history department and a professor of Latin American history here at NYU. I just want to mention a few things. If you need simultaneous translation, quieren traducción simultánea, there are, I think we've decided to call it apparatuses, aparatos, that can be distributed by the ushers. So if you please raise your hand, levanta la mano, si necesita el aparato, if you need the apparatus. We also will take questions at midway through the session. You should have received cards, tarjetas, to submit the questions, para submitir las preguntas, also to be distributed to the ushers. So if you need a card, just also raise your hand and let someone know that you need a card. If you want to submit a question on Twitter, for those who are watching the live stream, the Twitter hashtag is hashtag El Salvador Accords 2016. That's hashtag El Salvador Accords 2016. Also, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. Thank you. So this, well, according to the program, this session will break at 11:30. We are, of course, starting a little late. I mean, this is Saturday morning, so I think that's permitted. So we will start soon, and we will break close to 11:30. We will then resume at 1:30 for the final session on the, which will be a sort of semi-open discussion, a moderated discussion that everyone will be invited to participate in. And that will be in a different building and room. It will be in the Kimmel Center, which is right down the block walking east, really the next block walking east, a very big building. There are maps and many people can guide you over. And it will be in room 914 on the 9th floor of Kimmel. I think that's all the specific details I have. So I will move to sort of the introduction. So as many of you know, this is a conference jointly sponsored by the Center on Latin American and Caribbean Studies, CLACS, at NYU, and the Institute for Latin American Studies at Columbia. Other funders of this conference, generous funders, include my own department, the history department at NYU. But I particularly want to recognize the generosity of the two provosts of NYU and Columbia. At Columbia, we were very fortunate that the provost, aside from being an excellent administrator, is a very eminent historian of Latin America, John Coatsworth, who has written a major book on the Central American conflicts. And he very generously agreed to contribute a significant amount to the funding of this conference. And then my provost here at NYU, Dave McLaughlin, who's a mathematician and probably knows very little about El Salvador, nonetheless agreed that NYU would match the funding and similarly fund it. So I just want to mention how grateful we are to the two provosts for their support for this conference. I also want to thank again the entire organizing committee, Van Goss, Jill Lane, Jose Moya in absentia, Hector Lindo Fuentes, George Vickers, Omar Dawajre, and especially the miraculous Maritza Colon, without whom this would just have been impossible. And of course, I want to thank the many distinguished guests who made time to come and participate in this conference. If you'll forgive a slightly longer introduction than usual, I want to do two things. First, second, I will cite some topics or insights that have emerged from the discussion so far in the conference. And first, I briefly want to share with you the history of this conference, since I am a historian. So, starting with the latter. Most historians these days argue that it's hard or even impossible to determine exactly when a process began. So if I wanted to say exactly when did the conflict in El Salvador begin, there's many different ways to talk about that. But I can say exactly when the planning for this conference began, because I never delete emails. No. So, on July 11th, 2013, I received an email from a dear colleague, Marilyn Young, who studies U.S. foreign relations. And she wrote, "I had breakfast with Van Goss recently. He asked about the possibility of a conference on the peace process in El Salvador. I'm attaching his proposal. I told him it's summer, people are away, etc. But I was wondering if, along with the thousands of other things you're doing," I had to put that in, you could take a look at this and see if it's something the history department might help fund. Attached was a proposal for the conference, raising many of the issues that have emerged as central to the discussion. For a variety of reasons, despite everything else I was doing, I had to respond. For one thing, I began teaching Latin American history in the fall of 1979. And so for my first 12 years in the classroom, the conflict and then the civil war in El Salvador was ever present in my mind and in my conversations with my students and colleagues. Happily, CLACS and ILAS took up the idea as well. 323 emails later, here we are. So I want to take this moment to express my gratitude to Van Goss for both coming up with the idea and for keeping this ball rolling. So thank you, Van. I do want to just say a couple of things that Van mentioned in his original proposal that are relevant to what we'll be talking about today. So, for example, he said, what was the role of the FMLN's international solidarity apparatus in influencing various governments and aiding their war effort? What were the relationships of the FMLN to the Frente Sandinista in Nicaragua and Cuba? And how did those sympathetic governments either facilitate its armed struggle or encourage its pursuit of a negotiated solution? Finally, he said, how do the many different parties to this process evaluate its outcomes since 1994? Who or what won this war? And is that question relevant? So that would be something to think about for this afternoon. So moving on to what I see as some of the key highlights of yesterday's, sort of starting with the keynote and then yesterday's discussions. First of all, I think there was general agreement that the civil war in El Salvador should not be thought of primarily as a proxy war between the US and the Soviet Union, but rather it reflected internal socioeconomic and political processes, how much weight the different speakers gave to different sides of it, socioeconomic versus political, varied. But at the same time, of course, responses to El Salvador in the United States, both among the American public and the US Congress, were very crucial in determining various policies toward the war. It was also described as not just a war of the poor against the rich, but a much more complex socioeconomic conflict. Then there was the question of, was there a stalemate? Or an empate, can we talk about an empate or stalemate? Was the beginning of the negotiations about fatigue with the war, cansacio? Was it the cost of the war in lives, in economic decline? We also talked about the key role of the murder of the 6 Jesuits, their housekeeper, and her 16-year-old daughter, And I want to emphasize here that it was very clear from the context that while this had a particular impact, that of course there were many other murders and atrocities. And so it is not just the horrifying nature of that particular set of murders, but also the timing of it, which was seen as delegitimizing the military as an actor at a crucial moment. There were differing interpretations, interesting and differing interpretations of the impact of the end of the Cold War, with Facundo Guardado arguing that the end of the Cold War basically undermined the U.S. premise for support of the Salvadorian military. The key role of Alfredo Cristiani as president, as the Arena president, was repeatedly indicated because he was seen as a credible negotiator, whereas the implication being that José Napoleón Duarte, in an earlier iteration of peace talks, was not able to be as credible a negotiator. Also, somewhat different views of Roberto d'Aubusson emerged. Integration into the military and subsequent re-legitimization of the military was seen as crucial to the success of the peace accords, but it was also repeatedly indicated that the peace accords didn't create structures for dealing with the kind of gang violence that has emerged in El Salvador more recently, and this was also several times indicated as partly due to policies created by the United States itself. So on that note, I want to introduce the moderator of our morning session on external actors and the Civil War in El Salvador. We are very pleased to have William LeoGrande with us here to moderate this session. William LeoGrande is somebody whose work is known to anyone who studies recent Latin American history, politics, social movements, and U.S.-Latin American relations. He is Associate Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, Professor of Government, and Dean Emeritus of the School of Public Affairs at American University. He is the author of Our Own Backyard, The United States in Central America, 1977 to 1992, and co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, published in 2014, and I'm hoping it's selling really well now, Bill. We very much appreciate his joining us for this conference and for moderating this morning's session. And he will introduce the other members of the panel. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Barbara. If the rest of our panelists could come up and grab a seat. I want to start, of course, by also thanking the organizing committee for what's been so far, I think, a really fascinating conference, and we'll try to keep up the standard that was set yesterday. So let me begin by quick introductions of our panel, although you've got longer ones in the program. First, Rubén Zamora was a member of the Diplomatic Commission of the FDR FMLN, served as Vice President of El Salvador's National Assembly. He was presidential candidate of the Democratic Convergence in 1994. He's served as ambassador to the United States and is currently El Salvador's permanent representative to the United Nations. Francesc Vendrell had a 40-year career as diplomat at the United Nations and the European Union. And for our purposes, most importantly, he was the Secretary General's deputy representative in the El Salvadoran peace talks. Peter Romero is a retired career Foreign Service officer who worked for several years on issues related to El Salvador. He was chief of mission in El Salvador at critical moments during the peace process, and subsequently ambassador to Ecuador, assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. He serves today on for-profit and nonprofit boards and is CEO of Experior Advisory, LLC. And finally, Joaquín Chávez is a historian of Latin America with a particular focus on intellectuals, revolutionary movements, and the Catholic Church in El Salvador. He is currently assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and the author of Poets and Prophets of the Resistance, Intellectuals and the Origins of El Salvador's Civil War. And Professor Chávez has also been deeply engaged in peace and reconciliation work in his native El Salvador, as well as other hotspots in the world, including Nepal. So thank you all for joining us. To get started, I'd like to begin by talking about how the peace process began. And most of my questions will be directed to a particular member of the panel, but I also want to encourage other members to jump in if they have something to say about a topic that I've started out with another panelist. So, Peter, President Bush appeared to have a different approach to El Salvador than the Reagan administration. The Cold War was coming to an end, and we know that Secretary of State James Baker was interested in trying to build bipartisan support for the approach to bringing the Cold War to an end, and that Central America had been a very divisive issue over the previous 8 years. So as the new administration came in, how was the United States thinking about El Salvador and thinking about moving forward toward a resolution of the conflict?
Thank you, Professor. That's a very good question. I think there were a number of factors. You can't just cite one factor, two factors. There were a lot of motivations. As you said, I was in Washington for most of that time, and it was exceedingly divisive in our country. The parties were divided over it, Republican, Democrats. I can remember groups of nuns and other demonstrators almost on a weekly basis out in front of the State Department. Things were very, very tense, and I think the difference was that under Bush 41, they had gone through something called Iran-Contra, and there was a very definite desire to do what they needed to do to try to bring an end to the wars in Central America. And I remember the first thing that I was asked to do as Director of Central American Affairs at the time was to prepare a 7-page paper on what could be done. It had to be short. President Bush, Vice President Bush had won the election, so this was the interregnum period between the time that he had won elections and the time that he was sworn into office. And they wanted a short, concise blueprint. And I put that together, and quite frankly, looking at it, 20 years later, it was followed pretty meticulously. And that is that they realized that Central America had torn our country apart, that it was exceedingly divisive. They wanted a way out, and what they did do was to begin to move closer to a solution that included Esquipulas, that included what Oscar Arias was proposing at the time, and also the beginnings of contact with the FMLN. My boss at the time, Assistant Secretary Aronson, did have contact, very informally and very quietly, with the FDR in Washington. Some of that was transmitted to us underlings, some not, but he did have a regular contact with them. And I think that the war, our support for an end to the war, would have started earlier had it not been for the downing of a U.S. helicopter in El Salvador by the ERP and the killing of some of our crew members. And I remember very, very vividly, Secretary Aronson had been speaking to President Bush about the possibility of making contact with the FMLN on a deeper basis, a regular basis, and trying to do what we could to bring the war to a close. And I can recall after that helicopter was downed and our crewmen were killed, I was accompanying Mr. Aronson to the White House, and we were in under the awning of the West Wing, and President Bush came out with his bodyguards and said, "Bernie, nice job. You were recommending contacts with the FMLN, and now they've killed our crewmen. Nice timing," in a very sarcastic way. So that set things back, and I think probably the next thing that really did happen was the so-called final offensive, and I think you all talked about that yesterday. At my level at the State Department, we had our first contacts with the FDR and the FMLN because we had 4 trapped Americans in a hotel in San Salvador that we were trying to get released, and quite frankly, the FMLN was very helpful in trying to, Facundo Guardado was in the audience here, trying to get the U.S. troops out of the hotel safely. They were armed themselves. It could have been very, very bad, and the communication was excellent. That gave us another indication. And finally, during the peace talks in Mexico City, one of the things that still to this day astounds me is that I had established a relationship with the designated person by the FMLN to talk to me during the peace negotiations. And this was something like the 8th or 9th round of negotiations. And after a while, we would meet on a regular basis, on a daily basis, sometimes a couple of times a day during the talks, on the side. And he gave me a letter. And in that letter it said, among other things, we want to achieve peace. We want to do what we can. At the end of the day, we will disarm. And we do not want you to cut off military assistance to the Salvadoran military, which astounded us. I sent that back to Washington, and you could hear a pin drop. It was so astounding to us. But basically what they said was, you have the greatest influence over the Salvadoran military. We will be disarmed. They will have the guns, and we want you to maintain that influence and that assistance and technical cooperation, et cetera.
So, Rubén, I don't know, maybe you were one of the contact people that was talking with Bernie Aronson, but could you tell us how did the FDR FMLN perceive the shift in U.S. policy that began with the Bush administration?
I think that we perceive very vague the change. You know, because it was very difficult for us to perceive changes in the U.S. Position for two reasons. One, their presence in El Salvador, their complete support for the government that we could understood, but blur the changes. In the same way that I think that they didn't perceive our changes because we were changing. If you take the first proposal for the nation of the FDR FMLN, it was clear that that proposal means that the army has to disappear and only the democratic officers could be reincorporated into the new army. That was the proposal. The second proposal that we made some years after say that the merge of the two armies, that means the Zimbabwe model, right? Put together the two armies and put them. And at the end, was the acceptance of the Salvadorian armed forces with a constitutional reform. That means that was a complete change of position. But I suppose that was not well perceived as well, clearly, and not only in that camp. And that's why I insist in this was the crucial one. In that sense, for us was difficult. Secondly, because the relationship between us and the State Department was not very good, quite frankly, I can tell you. No, was not good. I was at that time for the Political and Diplomatic Commission of the FDR FMLN in charge of the United States. The Reagan administration was throwing me out of the country, right? I lost my visa and couldn't enter, and I needed usually to come here, not very often then, to be invited by Congress for a hearing or for whatever, or some senators that invited us, that they allowed me to have a waiver to enter the United States. That means it became very difficult to communicate here, right? And I think that created the problem. And what we see, or we perceive, is when the negotiation started seriously, right? That means when they sit down in Venezuela and agree in an agenda, agree that the United Nations has to be the intermediary between the two sides, and the whole thing started to cease to be dialogue and started to be negotiation, that for us was a fundamental change. A fundamental change. And when we saw that, then our perception of the way the United States is that first the United States stay outside the negotiation. We were very pleased with that, because we don't wanted another ally of the government in the middle of the negotiation. It's obvious. Secondly, I see the United Nations was pleased with that as well. But we saw how the United States started to be more and more involved in the process.
But Rubén, remember, the friends of the process, okay, was 4+1. And Secretary Baker wanted us to ensure that we were not one of the friends on paper, because that would have given us too much influence among the others. And we were the +1 for a very specific reason.
I don't dispute that. I am telling you what was our perception, that is Europe. But the United States, the State Department started to be more and more involved with a central problem that I discussed something like 3 times with Bernie Aronson, to whom I met when he was a Democrat, the officer, the main officer at the Democratic Party headquarters, that was, and we sit down and talk about the massacre and everything, and one time we started to cry together, you know, talking about that. But then when he moved to the Republican side, and was not, and then for the negotiation we started to talk again, and the fundamental problem that he was is, could we believe on those communists of the FMLN? That was a problem of credibility, the central problem. Why? Because they had the experience that they have with the Nicaraguan revolution, because they believed that the Sandinistas were a sort of good guys, you know, liberals, sort of advanced liberals that were doing a revolution that were going to do this, more or less the same thing. Well, the Nicaraguans were not the good guys in that sense, they were Marxists, right? And when they started to behave in the different way, they feel betrayed. And Bernie Aronson feel betrayed, and quite a lot of our friends in Congress feel betrayed. That was a big problem for us when we started to move there. But it was a problem of confidence. It was not, for the United States, a serious problem of content of the agreement. I think they give a space for that and do not intervene too much on that. In the process of negotiation, you know better than me about that, Alvaro. But their problem was the different one. And to gain confidence, a basic confidence on their part for the United States to support, and at the end the United States clearly was supporting the process of negotiation, and being very, very youthful in certain very critical moments at the negotiation, especially when they finished here in New York, then was a big problem. That's why I could tell you.
I would imagine that there was also a problem of credibility with the FMLN believing that the United States was really going to support the process. Joaquín, you were in El Salvador at the time, is that right? Would you talk to how people on the ground saw this shift in U.S. policy, and was it believable, and at what point did it really become believable?
Yeah, I think the main point I'd like to make is the importance of the peace movement that actually emerged in El Salvador in the mid-1980s, and I thought that most of the narrative on the history of the peace process in El Salvador has been centered on negotiations between the FMLN, the government, and the role that the UN played in the process, the group of friends, the United States. But I think a fundamental actor that has been pretty much left out of the narrative is pretty much the peace process, a peace movement that actually emerged in El Salvador in the mid-1980s, that had many different manifestations, and actually had a very coherent intellectual leadership, particularly on the part of Ignacio Ellacuría, who was pretty much one of the main forces behind this movement. So in that sense, I think that the way was interpreted, the change, was mostly, I believe, as a byproduct of a failure of the strategy, right? The war strategy. Basically was the main interpretation. In other words, the idea that the U.S. supported war strategy in El Salvador had failed, and mostly that this outcome was precisely open up a real possibility for a substantial dialogue and negotiation. So in a way, many of the sectors involved in this process, Catholic Church, social movements, and many others, thought that was a very, very crucial opportunity, right, to pretty much engage in the process. So that I would say was the main frame of interpretation, and but also I think there was a substantial frustration with the fact that their voices were not really taken into consideration, perhaps enough in the process, right? So in a way, they were seen as outside actors, or at the end of the story, not really a fundamental protagonist of the process, right? That was more or less the impression I have from my recollection.
Thanks. So, Francis, tell us a little bit about how the United Nations came to be involved, because normally the United Nations deferred to the OAS in the Western Hemisphere and tended to not become involved in these kinds of conflicts. So this was really, in some ways, unusual. So tell us a little bit about how that happened.
But that would be a fairly long explanation. Perez de Cuellar and his associates did not defer to the OAS necessarily. There was a tendency by the US to consider that any issue in the Southern Hemisphere was a matter for the OAS and basically an issue for its own backyard. So we became involved first with the Nicaragua process as a follow-up to the Esquipulas conference. Esquipulas, in my view, had made although Esquipulas did two things. On the one side, he pretended that it was trying to end the conflicts in Central America. In practice, the effort in Esquipulas was to ensure that there would not be an international war between Nicaragua and the US. So the concentration was on Nicaragua. But because they had to appear that the issues that were demanding of Nicaragua applied to everybody else, there was also a demand in the case of El Salvador and Guatemala. We used that as a way to become involved, first in Nicaragua, and secondly, the second step was El Salvador, and finally was Guatemala. Now, so I think there was an active interest on the part of the Secretary General, who was Latin American, and of us, to get the UN involved, because we felt that the UN probably had greater credibility with the FMLN and with perhaps the left. Now, I should point out that unlike the URNG in Guatemala, and unlike many rebel movements in Africa today, or the FMLN had a much greater international projection. In 1981, the presidents of France and of Mexico recognized the FMLN FDR as a substantive force. Secondly, the FMLN very intelligently managed to become an observer at the non-aligned movement, something that, in fact, the Salvadoran government, of course, was not. Now, I'll jump now to 1903. The UN had been deeply involved at the human rights level on the situation in El Salvador. And there had been yearly resolutions criticizing the human rights problems in El Salvador, with a special rapporteur and so on. That meant that, and it was not purely a Cold War division, supporting the resolutions criticizing the Salvadoran government were not only Cuba and the Soviet bloc, but most of the European countries as well. So there was a great deal of discussion about this. Now I jump to 1989, to May 1989. There was a meeting of foreign ministers of the non-aligned movement in Harare, which I attended on behalf of the Secretary General. The leadership of the FMLN, including Shafik Handal, Ana Guadalupe Martinez, were at the meeting. I had an entry to them. I had met Samayoa before, and anyway, we talked about the possibility of the Secretary General becoming an intermediary. They seemed to like the idea, at least they claimed they liked it. And then, while we were talking, an event occurred in Namibia. Namibia at that time was in a transitional period. The Secretary General had a special representative, but South Africa also had forces. SWAPO broke the agreement and brought forces into Namibia from Angola. The South Africans demanded from the SRSG, who was then Marty Atisari, that they be allowed to go and hit SWAPO for entering Namibia. And Atisari actually accepted. So the result of that was a larger number of casualties for SWAPO in 1989, when the UN was involved, was already there, than ever before. So this created enormous commotion in the non-aligned movement. Shafid Handal, Anna Guadalupe went to see Mugabe. And this issue they must have mentioned that they were thinking perhaps of the UN playing a role. Immediately Mugabe said, absolutely not. You are totally wrong. The UN is in the hands of the Americans. Look what is happening now in Namibia. And so we are not going to be able to. So they came back to me. They came to me and said, compañero, let's talk again. And I tried to persuade them that, well, behind the UN there were people, that the people that would be dealing with El Salvador would probably be a little stronger. But they were left with the feeling that, and we were left that, you know, how are you going to cope with the overwhelming pressure of the Americans when basically they are the only the main part involved, except for perhaps Cuba. So that's when I went back to New York. We talked with Alvaro, and the idea then developed of having a group of friends. A group of friends of the Secretary General, which I'm sorry to say did not include the US, because we basically planified the table of the negotiations as 3 concentric circles. One was the table of FMLN, government, and the PRSG, the SOTO. A second tier were the US, to some degree, Cuba and the Soviet Union. They were involved in the issue. And the third tier were the Friends. And the Friends were meant to help the Secretary General whenever he felt the need for them to either speak to the Americans or the Cubans, or indeed the two parties to the conflict. And we chose 4 countries, Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, and Spain. Spain, because at that time Felipe González was prime minister. He was well perceived in Latin America. And he was also a bridge to Europe. We chose Mexico because Mexico, of course, has been deeply involved in the issue. We chose Venezuela because we wanted to ensure that Venezuela and Carlos Andrés Pérez would play a supportive role and not perhaps go on a different tangent. And we finally chose Colombia because they were in the Security Council at the time. So that's how the Friends were established.
So, Peter, how did the United States react to this UN initiative?
Well, you know, much has been said about a term called the fog of war. On the battlefield, there's a fog. You don't know where the enemy, you don't know everything about the enemy, where you are, where your forces are. I'd call this the fog of diplomacy. I mean, I have to tell you, this is the first time I'm hearing this background in terms of why the UN. But I have to say that we supported the UN involvement simply because, and Francesc is too diplomatic to really talk about why, and that is because the OAS at the time could never have undertaken this. They're not structured to do this sort of thing. They would have had to set up a separate committee. They would have had to empower that committee through the Secretary General. It just, there is no precedent for it. And quite frankly, while a lot of the agencies of the OAS function very well, the General Assembly does not. And they would still be debating today about what to do in El Salvador, I have no doubt. So we supported it. There is a structure at the UN that we could work with that we were very comfortable with. And that is not only the General Assembly, but the Security Council, and then offices like Francesc headed and that sort of thing. We had great confidence in that, and we felt that it was a much better vehicle. And luckily, the government of El Salvador felt that way, and there was a confluence among all of us, even the FMLN, that this was a better way to go.
I think that in that way, why the United Nations is very interesting, because according to the Charter of the United Nations, clearly say that regional conflict has to be dealt first at the regional level, and only if it is failed, like a sort of Supreme Court of Justice, they go to the United Nations. That was. But the problem was that the government, President Cristiani government, wanted the American State Organization. The role in Nicaragua during in the process of the revolution had been very good about the American State Organization, therefore they have certain legitimacy, but we rejected completely. For the simple reason, you know, the whole story that the American State Organization is the Department of Colonies of the United States, as we used to call it. Really? Yeah, well. Then we say we wanted the United Nations. And that was the discussion. That's why it was necessary a letter of the Vice President to the General Secretary, asking the General Secretary to try to intervene to help in the process.
That's very important.
Yes, that is very important, because that gave the justification. That means because El Salvador wanted the negotiation, right, and was an agreement, okay, let's take the United Nations, right? Then the president of Central America, Esquipulas, presented that letter to the General Secretary. The problem, and this is my addition to you, was when the General Secretary named his personal representative, because it was a very negative reaction in our side, on you. I never have told you that. But it's true. Why? First, your brother, you know, that was writing the books, and then, oh my God, right? That was the reaction. This guy has to be very, very conservative. But secondly, somebody told us that you have been part of the Christian Democratic Party, right? That for us was, at that time with Duarte, being our opponent for so many years was nothing, right? But there was a big discussion between the FDR and FMLN. I remember Guillermo and myself being there discussing about because we were, the commandancia, I mean the FMLN, was clear that they cannot reject the representative of, but they didn't like it. But then somebody was illuminated and said, look, wait a moment. Yes, he was a Christian Democrat. But remember that our central point in this negotiation is how we get the military out of politics. Yeah. Otherwise, there is not going to be democracy in El Salvador, never. And the Christian Democrat supported the military regime, the progressive military regime in Peru. And the oligarchy, just in case that Don Álvaro Soto belonged to the oligarchy of Peru, was against the military. Therefore, he's the very good guy. Because that was the argument. You know, I can tell you now, 50, 25. And in fact, he was a very good on the issue of trying to move the country out of the military control. That was shared, but quite a lot of people of the party arena as well, starting with the president of Arena, who was Armando, that then became the president of the country in the next period. And that was, all those things helped a lot to move this thing in the way that they were good to move for the Salvadorian people. But I wanted to say that, just to see how sometimes things that look very bad could be arranged in become a very positive way.
Well, we're learning lots of new and interesting things in the conference. Joaquín, you were involved in the peace talks once they began. What was the toughest issue to resolve?
I think that was pretty well discussed yesterday. It was fundamentally the issue of demilitarization. Right? That was, and I actually wanted to take the opportunity to share some of my kind of larger interpretation, very briefly, of what kind of fundamental intellectual and political paradigm shift actually informed the FMLN negotiation policy in that period. Right? And my point is very straightforward. Right? There is basically a situation in which the French and Mexican Declaration of 1981, plus the Socialist International, were the fundamental political movements in states who actually articulated the fundamental thesis that ultimately resolved the conflict, right? Which was the only alternative to resolve the Salvadorian War is actually a negotiated political solution. And that was stated in 1981. That particular paradigm, right, actually experienced different transformations in the 1980s, but fundamentally did one fundamental thing, which was, is a paradigm that ultimately ended up transforming the FMLN itself, right? Basically, it became a kind of a political and diplomatic engagement that ultimately transformed the fundamental ethos of the FMLN. In other words, I'm talking about a fundamental shift, of course, a gradual shift that took roughly 8 years from a Marxist-Leninist movement into becoming what can fairly say a socialist democratic movement at the end of the decade. Right? It was, of course, a very complicated process. There were many important crises in that process in different, I won't give the details of the crisis, but the fundamental point I wanted to make is that the specifics of the negotiation policy of the FMLN in the 2-year negotiation mediated by the UN was fundamentally informed by that, or I would say perhaps better, was a derivative of that paradigm shift that took place in that particular time period. So in a sense, the consistency of what your question is about, of the objectives of the negotiation, had everything to do with this paradigm shift, which, and of course, that was very clearly explained yesterday, that the fundamental objective of the negotiation was precisely to conduct a demilitarization of the state and to enable a sustainable transition to democracy in the country, right? But again, it's basically the Socialist International plus the French and Mexican Declaration, who pretty much set the intellectual and political basis for those fundamental transformations in what ultimately this conference is about. It's basically a transition from war to peace. So basically the paradigm shift, right? The intellectual paradigm shift and political paradigm shift has everything to do with those fundamental premises set by the Socialist International and the French and the Mexican government.
So, Francesc, was there a moment when you thought that the talks would break down, that you wouldn't be able to actually get an agreement?
You mean once the talks had started?
Once the talks had begun, yeah.
No, I really thought that I've always felt that we would be able to succeed, because what the FMLN was demanding, and we discussed that yesterday, basically represented what even Washington deep down would want, which was the demilitarization of Salvadorian society and the establishment, really, of as far as possible, of a system based on the rule of law. And we also realized that the FMLN was aware that Pérez de Cuéllar was going to cease being Secretary General on the 31st of December 1991. It was also in their interest. And I think the US, once we overcame the period when the US felt that we were taking too long in discussing and trying to work out the military agreement, once that was done, I think we had a lot of support from them, and indeed from the French. So I didn't think that it would break down. So basically, no, there were difficult moments, but I never got the feeling that we were going to, that this was going to be a failure.
So, Peter, would you talk a little bit about the kinds of things that the United States tried to do to move the process along once the talks got going, confidence-building measures and that kind of thing?
Sure, but if I can just go back to the issue of whether this was a Cold War.
Sure.
Yeah, I think what I'm getting a sense of here is that the FMLN evolved over time. But there is no denying the fact that early on in the war, the FMLN went to people who could help them. And those people were the Soviet Union, Vietnam, and others. And I mean, it's a fact, okay? And there were people like Cayetano Carpio and others in the movement who were very hardline people and who were Marxist-Leninists. And Shafiq Kandal, if he were here today, would admit to you, he's a Marxist-Leninist, okay? So when you look at that, and you look at it through the filter or the context of what was happening in the United States at the time, President Reagan comes into office. He sees that we have problems everywhere in the world, that President Carter has been too weak, he believes, and we've got American hostages who had just been released on the day of the inauguration, had been captive for almost 2 years in Iran. And he's trying to assert American strength again as a goal of his. That's why he's elected to office. And at the same time, you have tumult and chaos and war in Central America in our so-called backyard. So to say that there was little to no Cold War context to this early on would be a big mistake. There was a big Cold War context to it in the United States. Now, that changed over time. Okay, that did change over time. And I think that a lot of it had to do with our direction from the White House to try to do what we could to ameliorate this situation and to bring it to peace. It had to do with the actors, both on the government side and on the FMLN side, that we talked about all of those kind of contacts and things that really helped along the way. I think that probably if there was ever a time when things got really stuck, it was about midnight on the night that Pérez de Cuellar was supposed to leave. And oh, by the way, he stayed, and Francesc remembers this, he stayed about 5 hours, 1 hour, okay. Yeah, they pushed the clock back. But he stayed beyond his mandate to get this done, with his wife waiting at an airport for him to leave, and he would not leave. She was there in the office. Anyway, one of the things that gave us confidence in the UN at the time was Pérez de Cuellar was a Latin American. He was a Peruvian, and he understood what was going on. There didn't need to be a lot of education, and he was committed to it. And in fact, his behavior showed it. He stayed beyond his mandate to get this done.
So, Rubén, and I'd like you to reflect on the impact that Ambassador William Walker's trip to Santa Marta had in June of 1991. My understanding is that this trip actually made an impression on the FMLN and sort of set a good stage, if you will, for moving forward. Is that your recollection as well?
Yeah, I think that he's one of the persons that I learned to respect a lot. And when he died, I really feel very, very deep in my heart. He's lost, or our loss of him. But the whole thing started very bad. Because when he came as ambassador, remember he came from Paraguay. He was ambassador in Paraguay and has confronted the dictatorship in Paraguay, very clearly. And then he was in El Salvador. And I have still some contact with him there. And what I noticed was somebody who was trying to impose in El Salvador has to be done this and this and this and that. Immediately, because our culture, I rejected that, and I have not very good relation with him. Right. Well, after, a little bit after I left the country, because I could be killed there, and I started the my diplomatic career there from zero, with my other friends who were on zero in diplomacy, right? We were learning, doing the whole thing, right? From zero. But anyway, and then we saw how he moved and the whole thing, that how he was sort of fighting for human rights, because basically that was his point at that time, human rights, and sort of the idea not to allow that the situation to deteriorate. And we started to respect him, quite frankly, until he was demoted, expelled as ambassador by the Reagan administration, and he became one of the most outstanding voices in the United States against the military control of the government, against the violation, and keep it that way his whole life until he died. In that sense, for us, the ambassador is a hero, but he's a hero who learned his process. I think Paraguay teach him, and it's very difficult to teach something to an ambassador who is in another country, in an ambassador in another country, yeah, because he's representing the another government. But he learned, and this is the important thing. In that, Walker remembered me a lot, Monsignor Romero. As well, he learned. Robert White, sorry. Say Robert White. Sorry.
Robert White, you were talking about.
Yeah.
Robert White.
Yes. Oh, you were asking me about?
You said William Walker.
Oh, William Walker. Oh my God, sorry. Because I was thinking, sorry, man. I was thinking.
I'm glad you mentioned Robert White because he deserves a mention.
Yes, because I don't know, I was thinking of him at that moment, and that's why I was talking to him. Sorry about that. Okay.
Okay. So, Joaquin, do you have any thoughts on Ambassador Walker's trip to Santa Marta in 1991 and the impact that had?
I think there were a series of events at the time that were part of the, well, we can generally term the ending of the war between the FMLN and the United States government, right? I think it was a similar event to the one that Shafiq Handal actually describes in his memoir that came out a few years ago, perhaps 2-3 years ago, big volume, in which he candidly talks about the first encounter, actually the meeting he had with, in other FMLN meeting, leaders had with Undersecretary Aronson. I think it was at the East Tower here in New York City. And roughly what this, I'm just paraphrasing Handel here, right? So basically, he said that Aronson actually entered a very sort of crowded room and basically said, and everybody, they were sitting on a bed and other places in the room, and he said, Aronson said, according to Handel, really interesting to see what Mr. Aronson remembers about the event, actually, right? But the point was very, very clear. He said, Aronson said, this might seem like an informal meeting, but in fact it's a very formal meeting, right? So I'm here representing the US government to declare that the war between the US government and the FMLN has ended. And that the second point was that the United States government wants to establish friendly relations with the FMLN, right? That was Aronson's. So Handel, in the memoir, he writes that he responded very briefly saying, first, I also want to tell you that we're very happy that the war between the United States government and the FMLN has ended. And Handel added, hopefully the United States had never actually participated in this war, but he followed with this, another sort of statement saying, we also want to establish friendly relations with the United States based on two conditions. He said, first condition, that the United States play a very active role in the implementation of the peace accords, and in particular, that the United States actually deal with the resistance that certain segments in the Salvadoran military might have to the military reform. And secondly, he said, we want friendly relations under the premise that the FMLN is not a subordinate actor of the United States, right? And that mutually productive relations of cooperation should be established. Right? And then Aronson responded pretty much emphasizing that he was in the capacity to pretty much say yes to those. So basically, I guess the visit of Ambassador Walker was part of a series of events in that period There's another event in which Ambassador Pickering was also involved, but the message is the same, right? Basically, it's a new, to me as an historian, right, the meaning of these events is very significant in that at the end of the war, apparently, and of course in a private setting, the US government actually acknowledged what everybody knew, that the US government was a party in the war, right? They formally acknowledged it in a private matter, in a private sense. And in that sense, that acknowledgement, in my view, is as important actually as the peace settlement signed between the FMLN and the Salvadorian government, right? And actually also emphasize a premise of the initial period in the FMLN, FDR diplomacy, in which, this is probably something that Rubén will remember, that one of the first demands of the FMLN, FDR was pretty much direct conversations between the FMLN, FDR, and the US government, right? That was the first sort of demand, and eventually it came down to that particular direct dialogue towards the end of the war. In that sense, it's one of those significant events that mark the end of the war, right, and the start of a new, more productive relation.
Mm-hmm. So before we turn to questions, I want us to have a little bit of a chance to talk about the implementation phase of the peace agreement. Francesc, could you tell us a little bit about the role that ONUSAL played and what going in to the implementation phase were the highest priorities?
Well, I have to say that I will ask Álvaro de Soto to also say something, because my role in El Salvador was during the whole peace negotiations, and in particular the deployment of ONUSAL human rights side. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, was extremely good. I want to say that we were, about the deployment of ONUSAL, the human rights field mission, that we had a meeting in Geneva in June 1990, paid for by the Swedish government, which brought together approximately 20 human rights experts from all over the world, some of the most credible people. And we sat with them at the Soto and I, and basically to ask the following: the Salvadorian government was already a party to most human rights instruments. So that was not, the problem was not adherence to human rights in law. The question was implementation of the agreement. And eventually, the formula, we thought, well, ideally, it would be superb to be able to deploy a civil mission, just as before there were military missions, a mission of human rights observers who would be deployed across the country and which would have enormous, with a great deal of rights and with a mandate that would be extremely fulfilling. We thought, of course, this would be splendid. I don't think we expected that the Salvadorian government would accept this formula. Nonetheless, a month later, we went to Costa Rica, and the first meeting took place. I actually was dealing with Guatemala on that particular occasion, and I gather that when the proposal was made, 2 days later, or a day later, Alvaro will remember better, actually this proposal that we thought perhaps no Salvadorian government would accept actually was accepted. And then, although we had agreed in Geneva, when we set up the framework agreement, that nothing was agreed until everything was agreed, we did have the opportunity, and I think the US was helpful on that occasion, in getting the Salvadorian government to accept the deployment of ONUSAL human rights several months before the agreement was concluded. And I think the role of ONUSAL there on the human rights side was enormous. And I think the impact was also enormous. Now, when it comes to other aspects of implementation, like the electoral and the DDR process, I was less involved because by then I had moved on another topic.
So can we get you to say a few words about the rest of the implementation?
Thank you. Perhaps to clarify slightly, the idea of a nationwide, long-term monitoring of human rights was in itself quite revolutionary. It had never been tried before anywhere by anyone, right? And in fact, the Human Rights Center at the time, the predecessor of the High Commission for Human Rights, was extremely prudent and said, no, we can't do this, we won't do this. Right? So it fell into the laps of the Secretariat in New York to organize this whole thing. But this came only after the agreement was actually reached. Now, I have to confess that it was I who insisted that this monitoring of the compliance with the human rights obligations of the parties was only something that could be done once there was a ceasefire. I put that in out of prudence because of consultations with the people on the peacekeeping side at the United Nations Secretariat, where they were, in those times, quite rigorous on insisting that we didn't get involved in peacekeeping unless there was a peace to keep. Things have evolved a bit since. Right? Now, what happened was that the reaction against the FMLN negotiators by their own people in the field at the time, or at least so we were told. Not only in the field. Not only in the field. I mean, there was, right, in some of your own people in your own leadership, as well as people in the field, because they had departed from the script according to which there would be nothing until there was an agreement on the army issues, was such that they said, well, and on top of that, you're giving us an agreement that's not even going to be complied with right away. And it's at that time that the FMLN said, listen, we have no objection to monitoring beginning earlier. And the government at that time was sort of cornered into saying, yes, we will accept that monitoring. That's how that evolved. But as to the deployment of the, later on, of ONUSAL, that was not an issue. Let's say the issue had been overcome when the Security Council, at a time when some members, 2 permanent members of the Security Council, were against any reference whatsoever in Security Council resolutions to anything involving human rights at that time, they nevertheless accepted, in a sort of a leap of faith, that there could begin the deployment of ONUSAL solely for the purpose of monitoring human rights, on the understanding that this was the first stage in a process that could lead down the road to an overall peacekeeping mission. So that sort of broke the floodgates and allowed easily. By that time, of course, we had had ONUCA for a certain amount of time, so people had gotten used to the idea that people with blue berets going around in the region was not necessarily a spearhead of the advance of world communism or something like that, right? So that facilitated. So there was never any issue on that account.
Thank you. Before we turn to the questions, Peter, I'd like to ask you, you were chargé d'affaires when the ad hoc commission report came out and recommended the retirement of virtually the entire high command, which, of course, the armed forces was not too happy with. Would you talk a little bit about the role that the United States played in seeing to it that that didn't derail the whole process?
That's an excellent question, and I think your whole thrust here with respect to the implementation of the Accords is just as important as reaching the Accords. And we tend to overlook that part of it. Oh, they reached the accords, fine, we'll move on to the next subject. No, it was tough. It was tough work. It was hard work, as everyone knows. But just to backtrack a little bit, I was in Washington for most of this time during the discussions of peace accords, and for the exception of a hiatus between '84 and '88, I was involved in El Salvador since 1980 from the Washington side. And it was obvious that what was happening in Washington was because of the murder of the Jesuits, we were losing our support in Congress. And I remember a key vote in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee where Nancy Kassenbaum from from Kansas, was being lobbied heavily to cut off aid to El Salvador. And I went to her and I said, look, no matter how you feel about this, they're in the middle of negotiations and this will derail negotiations. And she voted in favor of continuing aid, which was key at the time. But it was obvious that the clock was ticking here, okay? With respect to the implementation and the ad hoc committee, one of the things that was different from my stay in El Salvador as chief of mission and chargé and my predecessors as ambassadors was that while I served at the courtesy and acceptance of the government of El Salvador, and I never lost sight of that, my primary goal there was to make sure that both sides implemented and were obligated to what they had signed on to with respect to the peace accords. That was my number one priority, and it was obvious to all of us that if one side was able to slack off on implementation, completion of their part of this, that the whole thing would unravel. And when the FPL had been found with hiding weapons, we cut off assistance to the FPL during that time. When that taller in Nicaragua blew up and discovered all this stuff, we cut off assistance. And when the de facto or the ad hoc committee led by Abraham Rodriguez decided that they would basically take out, I think it was 52 officers, 100, more than 100.
The number was never made public.
But never was well.
Only 4 people know it.
I've got it on good authority over here as an officer in the Salvadoran military. But there's a picture that my deputy chief of mission, Phil Chicola, has, and it was a Sunday at Coatepeque Lake. And Abraham Rodriguez asked me to walk out on a dock to talk to me privately. And I walked out on the dock, and this is when he told me that tomorrow he was going to be issuing a list to President Cristiani, and that he wanted me to know ahead of time that the whole high command, save one general and 100 others, would be cited by them and they would have to leave. And I remember when he gave me some of the names and he gave me this, Phil has a picture of me pulling my hair out, you know, bending over like this, oh my God, what's going to happen? But on Monday morning, I asked to see the high command because I felt they had already gotten the news and I felt that they needed to hear it from us and not be ambiguous about where we stood on it. And I met with them. And I said, you know, you all have, except for, I think it was General Jimenez, what was his name, the one general? Vargas. But that they all had to leave. And, you know, the question to me was, well, this is not fair. And it wasn't fair. They had no right of reclama to any of this, but it's what they had signed on to. And they couldn't not comply, as far as I could see, because if they didn't comply, the whole thing would unravel. And they did. Where the difficulty came was with some of the colonels who felt that this was manifestly unfair and unjust. And at the time, I called Bernie Aronson in Washington and I said, I need some help here, Bernie. There's some officers that are digging in. They just don't want to, they don't think it's fair. They don't think it's just. They're right, but they've signed on to it. They've got to do it. And he said, let me see what I can do. And he came back about an hour later and he said, there's a General Colin Powell, who is chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he is in a visit in Chile, and he's coming back to Washington. It was a weekend, and he's coming back to Washington, and I'll see what I can do to have him stop by and talk to the Salvadoran Military High Command and others. And I said that would be great. In fact, he did. He spoke to them at the military school. He's a quick study and talked about how when you sign on to the military, you give yourself to your country, that some of you fall on the field of battle, some people fall on the field of politics, but you always put your country first. And I'm with you, I understand where you're coming from, it's not fair, but this you've got to do for your country. And I have to tell you, it was very emotional. And you could hear a pin drop in that room. It was at the military academy, and they all did the right thing after that.
So we have just a couple of written questions, so we may have some time for broader questions as well, but let me do the written questions first. So after the 1989 FMLN offensive, the Friends arranged a trip to Europe for FMLN commanders. How important was that trip in fostering the commitment to negotiations by the FMLN? Rubén?
Sorry.
I think you need to, can you repeat the
Yes.
first bit?
Yeah. So after the offensive,
Yeah.
right, the Friends, the group of Friends, arranged a trip. The group of Friends, I assume that's what it means, to Europe for FMLN commanders. How important was that trip in fostering the FMLN's commitment to the negotiations?
Well, in my opinion, the most important was the offensive. Probably without the offensive of '89 of the FMLN and how it develops, will be impossible the negotiation. Why? Because the negotiation, as we know, as you say in English, is always the second best. Prior to the offensive, the armed forces of El Salvador and the United States, I don't know if it's Department of Defense or the whole government, believe that the FMLN was strategically defeated already, and that the only thing was going to come was a process of bandage by the remaining of the FMLN, as happened in those cases. And I am talking about, because that was told to me directly by the Vice Minister of Defense of El Salvador when I have a talk with him. He said, no, because I knew that the offensive was coming. And I say to him, why, don't you think that maybe they are going to do something? I say, no, he said, you hear too much Radio Venceremos. They are already defeated strategically. It's a question of time. On the other hand, in our conversation with the commandancia of the FMLN at that time, prior to the offensive, in which Guillermo Ungo, Padre Yacuría, and myself went there and had in two occasion conversation, there was a big discussion. And the discussion was always sobre the point of if there was insurrectional elan on the part of the masses or not. We were, the three of us, Yacuría, Guillermo, myself, telling them, there is tiredness about the conflict. What people want is a solution, not insurrection. Please understand that. And the thesis of the commandancia at that moment, expressed to us, was to say, no, Rubén, no, Guillermo. What happened is that the spirit of insurrection of the masses still exists, but we, the force, the military force, are too separated from them, and what we have to do is to close that gap, come to the city, and then the spirit of insurrection of the masses will raise, and we are going to have and that's what they try to do it. Remember that most of the FMLN combatants that went back from the offensive to San Salvador were with carrying two rifles, and after that, 2 or 3 trucks full of arms were discovered in San Salvador, were left there. Why? Because everybody who know about insurrection know that the first thing that you have to do is to start to give arms to the people and tell them you shoot that way. It doesn't matter what do you shoot, because that is what creates the whole spirit of an insurrection, right? What then the insurrection show to both sides? You are wrong. The FMLN is not defeated strategically. How can you say that a guerrilla has been defeated strategically if they can take a big part of the capital of the country for 3 or 4 days and then retire, move backward as if they're doing nothing, and the army cannot do anything against them? Come on, right? And on the other hand, for the FMLN was absolutely clear that no insurrectional spirit existed in the country. That, for me, is a determining factor. And on top of everything, the military committed the worst political error that they have committed, killing the Jesuit. Why? And this is, for me, absolutely clear. They wanted to kill Ellacuría. Why? Because Ellacuría was talking with President Cristiani about a political solution. He told the commandancia as well. In those meetings, I say, no, President Cristiani is opening the way for a political solution. Give him time, they say. Give us time to move the whole thing. But the commandancia was not going to stop, something that they have been preparing, and believing that was the right thing to do. And then when the military killed, what they wanted to kill is Ellacuría, because Ellacuría was the possibility of a political solution according to their perception, because the president was moving to war, or at least that was. And this is something that we have to do. That's why I think that offensive was the turning point for opening the second best, that was the negotiation. In that sense, for me, this is a very crucial moment that we have to understand in the history of our country. And that's why sometimes from mistake on both sides, or from error on both sides, something good comes.
So I have a couple of written questions that I'm going to direct to Peter, because they ask, how could the United States justify providing military assistance to a government that for so many years in the 1980s was a gross and consistent violator of internationally recognized human rights?
Very good question, and it was very difficult to do. It's one of those issues where you don't have any great options, okay? We face in the world today those kinds of situations even more so than we did back then. You don't have great actors. You don't have white hats and black hats. You have a lot of gray area, and it was very difficult. We did know that if El Salvador fell, that there would be chaos there, that there were revolutions going on in Guatemala at the time, lots of terrorism in Honduras, and there needed to be some stabilization. And did we have to hold our nose in a lot of areas? Yes, we did. But there wasn't a lot of great options.
So far, we've been able to have a conference and talk about some controversial issues without too much disruption. So I hope we'll have respect for all the speakers that have come and shared their history with us today. Peter, you want to?
Thank you. Sometimes you make decisions based on what could happen if you don't act, what could happen even worse. Basically being able to look around the corner, if you will. I think that in many ways, those people who deserve applause today are not necessarily those people who at the UN or in Washington or in the capitals of the Friends, but those Salvadorans who put aside personal loss and the killing of family members and maiming and wounding and that sort of thing, and not just from the FMLN side, but from the private sector and the government side, who at some point in time decided that enough was enough and came together enough to be able to craft a peace and to get that peace enacted. Is El Salvador perfect today? No, it's not perfect today. There's a lot of problems, and I would hope that Salvadorans would come together the way they did back then to solve their own problems now under strong leadership, the kind of leadership that Cristiani showed at the time. But, it's great to sit in the back of the room and to say you have blood on your hands when what we were trying to do was to mitigate as much as we possibly could. Did we evolve over time? U.S. government, State Department? Absolutely. But I think what you can get from this whole exercise is that everybody evolved over times. And there became a confluence where everybody decided that peace was the right thing to do at that particular time.
Cindy?
I have a question. I'm feeling a bit frustrated by the questions in writing. I thought that yesterday afternoon we sort of did away with that, or no, we're not going to do that. So you don't want a question from the floor? Why not? Okay, I'll go ahead. It's mostly a question for Pete, but also Francesc and even Alvaro. There was, I think, the perception of a great deal of tension between the Bush administration and particularly Bernie Aronson, and I wish he were here to address this directly, between Bernie and Alvaro de Soto. I don't want to personalize this, but a general perception that the UN negotiators were more on the side of the FMLN than they were on the side of the Salvadoran government. And I was wondering if people could address that. I know that you know, Bernie was one of the principals and is not here to, you know, to address it directly, but I was just wondering if any of you could shed light on that phenomenon.
Bill, you want me to answer?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, first of all, let me correct the record, because Bill, or I guess Rubén, had mentioned that Bernie had moved from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. He never did. He served the Republican administration, but he still, to this day, is a Democrat and would take issue at you calling him a Republican. But I think that I can't think of, I mean, during the course of the negotiations, they went on for about 2 years, if my memory serves, and there were ups and downs and peaks and valleys and that sort of thing, but I never felt that we had lost confidence in the UN in doing this. I really didn't. I think that we had issues with some of the friends. I can tell you right now, Pico de Coana, the Spaniard representative, head of Latin America for the Spanish government, we had serious problems with. But that was okay, because the Spaniards had a very good relationship with the FMLN, and the purpose of creating the Friends was to have a representative body that could assist both sides in moving this ahead. So it wasn't a big deal. Cynthia, I don't remember there being really a disconnect between the United States and the UN. I don't know, Alvaro, do you recall?
Did you feel a disconnect?
I recall it vividly. Let's say, the point from which I felt that I had strong confidence on the US side for what the UN was doing began in September of 1991. But until then, one could almost feel, smell, taste the suspicion and the distrust. I mean, there's a long record of second guessing that seemed like undercutting, frankly. I'll say it quite openly. I've actually said it in writing before. I've published this. But I mean, people can have differences, and differences can be ironed out, and sometimes it takes time, and that is understandable. And I agree, by the way, that most of the parties evolved over time. You're absolutely right, Peter, in this. Including, I was also very quite fascinated to learn about my own political antecedents in the course of because of the revelations of Rubén here. I had an uncle who was, in fact, a very prominent Christian Democrat leader, and he was a senator for about 30 years, and he was even vice president of Peru. But you know, I dabbled in university politics, but more of as a maverick than in association with any political grooving. And I'm actually very interested to hear that there was a suspicion. I had heard that there was at least one member of the FMLN General Command who was convinced that I was in the pay of the CIA. And so I thought that that more or less balanced things out. But in any case, I think that was resolved over time, and I think it would. I had the enormous benefit of having the complete trust of the Secretary General at the time, right? And that he stood, as Tom Pickering put it, stalwartly behind me, and that it sort of helped things along. We were, I think, and we had reason to be, confident that what we were doing was the right thing, and that asking us, as we were in effect being asked at a certain point to, as a practical matter, move the goalposts, try to sort of unilaterally, arbitrarily, when we were merely the third party that was trying to help them to reach an agreement, change the rules that had been set by agreement between the parties was an inappropriate thing to be doing. But we overcame. If I can just clarify one or two little historical points for the record about the Friends. Francesc's version, by the way, of it is perfect down to the last detail. But I would add a couple of things. The first is that whilst we agreed that it would be a good idea to have such a grouping that would be a sort of buffer, knowing that the Security Council has a tendency, when there is a group of countries who play a prominent role, to allow them to lead it, simply because the security, or to take their sort of their keynote from such a grouping. We thought that it would be useful to have countries who were not on particular sides on this, who were not taking sides. They were almost by definition neutral, and they were in touch with both sides and therefore able to be helpful. But for the first, I would say, 14 or 15 months of the negotiation, we did not deal with them as a group. They only became a group starting in July of 1991, in fact, when there was an Ibero-American summit in Guadalajara, Mexico, and President Salinas took the initiative of inviting the Secretary General together with the presidents of Venezuela, Colombia, and the Prime Minister of Spain. Now, this was precipitated by an incident. The leader of Venezuela at the time, Carlos Andrés Pérez, was irrepressible, and he took a great interest in matters Central American, not only matters Central American. And at one point, he thought that at an admittedly difficult moment in the negotiations, after the constitutional reform agreements of April 1991, he took an initiative without notifying us in advance, which failed, but the other friends thought that it would be useful perhaps to put him back on the straight and narrow. And this was achieved in July. And it's only from that moment that we dealt with them as a group. Now, of course, they all knew that I was seeing each of the other ones separately. They knew it perfectly well. But the other point about the rules that applied to the Friends of the Secretary General was that they were that, precisely, Friends of the Secretary General. And we wanted to make sure, and that was one of the purposes, that they realized fully that the Secretary General was in charge of this negotiations, and that if they really wanted to help, it would not be a good idea for each of them to go off on their own, but rather that we would keep them informed, and we did in considerable detail, perhaps more than they that they wanted to process, but we would keep them informed, and we asked them, please act only at our bidding. And we gave them talking points, quite frankly, and they did it, each of them in their own way, and they played an important collaborative effort. Sorry for branching off.
Thank you. Francesc, did you want to add something?
No, I suspect that just as the FMLN in 1989 was concerned that Alvaro was conservative and possibly might be swayed by the Americans, I think that they learned, or they found out soon afterwards, that actually he was no easy push, and that he actually was not necessarily sympathetic to the FMLN as opposed to the government, but was going to stand for, our effort was to achieve what we had set out to do. And in some ways, perhaps there was some coincidence with the FMLN, that is the changing of Salvadorian society into a civilian-led, rule of law-based administration.
So we're almost out of time, but I want to give each of the panelists an opportunity for final words and encourage you, if you would, to looking back at, is there anything in the Accords that should have been different or that proved to just not be feasible? In other words, looking back on this, what lessons can we take from it for other conflicts as well? Let me start with Joaquín and just come this way.
Yeah, I have a sort of like main thought, which is that as far as the implementation phase goes, I think that it achieved very limited goals pertaining the demobilization of the two armies and some very basic aspects of reintegration into civilian society. But there was a fundamental, in my view, failure in the political economy of peace, which meant that even though the accord was, I think it was in many different respects a paradigmatic achievement, right? But as far as the implementation phase, I think that there was a fundamental tension or contradiction between the kind of not only lack of resources, it was an element, right? If you think about, for instance, about the $4.1 billion that the United States government actually invested in the war, and think about the amount of money that was invested in the transition to peace, it's a very modest amount, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that the cost of war was immense, not only in terms, obviously, of the more than 75,000 Salvadorians who were actually victims mostly of state violence, the thousands of disappeared people, the almost 1 million displaced people from El Salvador and refugees as a result of the conflict. You know, in short, it was a social catastrophe of inordinate or unprecedented proportions, not only in Salvadorian history, but in many respects in Latin American history. Some historians have pointed out that this displacement of 1 million people in the case of El Salvador as a result of this war is only comparable with the displacement produced by the early process of the Spanish conquest in the region, right? It's only comparable in magnitude, in historical magnitude. If you think around those proportions, right, I thought that the peace accord, particularly in its implementation phase, was permeated by a very technocratic and in many ways short-sighted vision. And I think in many respects, even though I beg to disagree with some of my esteemed colleagues that discussed this matter yesterday in a previous panel in which some assertions were made in the sense that the current social crisis and crisis of criminal crisis in El Salvador, war violence, and all of these things have nothing to do with the legacies of the war. I beg to actually disagree with that premise. Of course, one has to understand in very particular ways what kind of legacies have what kind of impacts, right? In the social realm, in the economic realm, in the psychosocial dimensions, in the cultural dimensions, which of course is something that needs to be explored, right, from an academic and even scientific perspective. But I as a premise, I basically kind of disagree with that kind of assessment. And the reason is that precisely, the fact that the political economy of peace was simply insufficient, right? And basically that has had, in many respects, a very catastrophic result for El Salvador. And this is something that I have to say, just as my last commentary. I have actually conducted research on post-war processes in El Salvador. I interviewed many members of the Salvadorian military, soldiers, even members of the high command at the time, of course, members of the FMLN, and they all agree pretty much on this point, right? They basically talk about the insufficiencies in resources that the state, the Salvadorian state, had to actually comply with this enormous challenge, right, of how to deal with these catastrophic results of the war, right? So that's my commentary.
Thank you. Peter.
Well, I don't share his view about the international community not stepping up. There are never enough resources when you're talking about a country with the wide income gaps and the underdevelopment that El Salvador had. But let's keep something in mind here. This was a peace process that was meant not just to drop weapons and to sing kumbaya, but to try to reform key government institutions. And I think that the process that was involved in that, and there's nothing that I would say was superfluous or unnecessary or something that was lacking. I think it was a pretty good process with a lot of really good components. But I think where the failure has come is in the kind of leadership that El Salvador had under Freddie Cristiani. You can say what you want about Cristiani, particularly in his post-presidency. But at the time, he was a president that stepped up. And he wanted peace, and he made sure that it happened. And in terms of the implementation of the peace process itself, where it has fallen apart is that that all of the parties in El Salvador have gone to their respective corners in the boxing ring and have gone back to doing what they normally do, not in warfare, but in politics. That's where it's fallen apart, as opposed to continuing the momentum of reform and making this a real process that continues over time, that brings together political parties for the sake of the country the way they did back in that time. This is where it's fallen apart, unfortunately.
Francesc.
Well, I think, and I've been involved in quite a number of other peace processes afterwards, and I have followed what's been done elsewhere. I don't think any mediator or team of mediators have succeeded in carrying out or engineering so much change in the course of a 2-year negotiation. I think we were, I will also not only say Alvaro, but I myself, I think we were daring, and we had the support of the Secretary General. In other negotiations, perhaps the mediator hasn't been as daring, or the support he or she enjoyed wasn't so strong. There's been some discussion even that we did not tackle the economic and social issues in El Salvador. Having been involved at the beginning in the negotiations on Guatemala, I would disagree that I don't think that negotiations for reach towards a peace agreement should really cover what I would call an economic and social program. Partly because the implementation of this program is incredibly long. It can only be carried out on a progressive basis. And therefore, the kind of verification by third parties fails away. Countries are interested in seeing the militarization, the removal, elections, constitution making, but they're not really up to following up in a 15-year process how land reform or how an economic and social rights are implemented. So I think we achieve as much as possible. I want to add one thing for the record, and this is the role of a priest, Rafael Moreno. And again, I want to link this to the importance of the human rights issues in terms of El Salvador. The reason why in the West there was so much interest on El Salvador and so much support, not sympathy for the FMLN, but certainly anger at the government, was the human rights violations in El Salvador. Now, in the 1980s, I had been involved for a variety of reasons on this human rights situation in Chile. I had a great deal of contacts with Amnesty International. And at the church center in New York, there was a woman called Margot Picken, who was the representative of Amnesty, and nearby there was the representative of the FDR FMLN, a Jesuit priest called Rafael Moreno. With Rafael, I developed very close links, and I think Rafael helped in opening the door to the involvement of the UN and to ensuring that the UN would have the right credibility. So Rafael played an important role behind the scenes throughout the entire negotiations. He's now in Mexico, but I just want to pay a tribute to him because he played a very important role behind the scenes.
Well, two things I guess I wanted to express. Both are vacuum. One in our discussion these 3 days or 2 days, and the other is in the country. The first thing is that in all our discussion we have not dealt with what for me is one of the fundamental elements to explain why we succeed in the negotiation, and is the negotiation or the table outside the negotiation. We have talked about on the table, what happened or what didn't happen, under the table, the back channels, already we have talked about. But the other element that in a negotiation of the size of the Salvadorian, with the problematica that was confronting, has been absent, is society. And in El Salvador, we have to recognize something. There was a fundamental change in the ideology of the people through the process. Remember, at the beginning of the war, to talk to the other side was an example of treason, or that you are selling yourself to the other side. That was for them, for the military, and for us, right? That was very clear. At the end, and therefore, you have to confront. No way, if you don't talk to the other side, you have to kill it in terms of politics, because in the end, it's a problem of power, right? At the end of the negotiation, at the end of the process, negotiation was the ideology of the people. That was a change in the mentality of the Salvadorian people. I feel myself very proud to be part of that process, to help to change the mentality of our people. Because not only the FMLN, not only the government changed, the people changed. And because the people changed, the implementation of the peace agreement has a space that didn't have in Guatemala. And I am afraid to say, I don't know what is going to happen in Colombia, because I don't see that change in the mentality. On the contrary, I see the opposite, right, in the case of Colombia. And remember that the peace agreement in Guatemala was rejected in a popular vote, in a referendum. Horrible, right? Well, that is the first. We have to take that into account in our discussion and govern. But the second is about the thing. The other thing that seems to me is absent to the whole process is what you have said, the socioeconomic dimension. But let me tell two things about that. It was impossible to discuss that. You cannot sit down a government that was starting to implement a neoliberal program reduction of the state, privatization, and so on, because that was the proposal of the government of Arena at that time, right? You could be against that, but that doesn't matter. That's what their proposal, and they were the government. And bet an economic agreement with a group that was thinking in terms of socialism, right? No, it's impossible. There is no the necessary space to have an agreement. And secondly, if you want to deal with the economic problem, guerrilla and government alone cannot solve those problems, because there are actors that are absolutely indispensable to do it, to be there, the private sector, the other sector of society. That's why it's impossible. It's not a failure of the peace agreement, it's the impossibility. But that doesn't mean that the whole thing has changed, and because it was impossible, the problem doesn't exist. Continue to be true what President Cristiani is saying in his speech in Chapultepec. That is the most clear definition I have found of the problem. This war is because economic and social exclusion and political exclusion. We deal with political exclusion, we have not dealt with other exclusion, and that's why we have the problem that we have now in El Salvador. Therefore, I want to finish just saying that this is the best task that now we have. Not the two actors of 25 years ago, but more complex actors, because we have to face, if we want to get out and have security and development in El Salvador, we need to deal with the socioeconomic exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks to our panelists. Thanks to our audience, and now on to the next session.